This time it is tech, trends, and trivia with Freiburger. This is going to be a Q&A, and it's based mostly on stuff that was posed to me by followers on Facebook, and we're going to talk about all kinds of stuff. It'll range from the new-ish Edelbrock VRS carburetor all the way to me telling a story about seeing the filming of an episode of CHiPS when I was a little kid. Now, I'm going to suggest that you could listen to this as a podcast. Just put it on in the garage, let it play, and it'll be way better than talk radio. There's no politics involved. Of course, you also can watch. There's going to be visual aids, but I think listening's probably a pretty good call. Let's get into the corner of my garage and dig in. Now, we can get into the section of general automotive stuff, and I did post on Instagram to get these questions from followers, and so I'm going to be able to name the people mostly who have asked me these questions. General automotive stuff. What made the original Boss 302 so special? And that came from somebody called DX Files. Well, I think it's that generally today we consider the 1969 Mustang sports roof to be one of the most beautiful cars ever designed. What we need to remember, though, is that that car and the Mach 1 that is so highly vaunted were already designed by the time a guy named Larry Shinoda ended up working at Ford. Shinoda having been also partially responsible for the mid-year Corvette and a bunch of other stuff later in his career. What I should do is an entire history piece just on Larry Shinoda. But when he came in, he looked at the Mach 1 and basically said, this thing is garish. Too much junk on it. And he did things like removed the little scoop in the side of the 69 quarter panel. And of course, he designed a stripe on the Boss 302. All of his work here being on the Boss 302. So I think that different styling take on such a radical body style is part of what made the Boss 302 so special. But also, of course, it is the fact that the car was built for homologation, there you go, for Trans Am racing. And of course, they had the limit in the Trans Am Road Race Series of 305 cubic inches. So Ford took their 302 and made a special racing engine out of it called the Boss 302. Essentially what it was the heads from the upcoming Cleveland engine atop a Windsor block. And all of a sudden you had these massive ports, tons of racing potential out of this engine. Solid lifters, thread-in core plugs or, water plugs on the side of the block. A lot of trick special stuff that made that engine sort of legendary. And of course, it went on to race in the Trans Am series with guys like Parnelli Jones, Bud Moore, and that really sealed the legacy of them. And the other great thing about the 69 Boss 302 Mustang is that all of them came with 4 speeds. So I think it's the combination of special trim, limited edition, racing, all new engine, manual transmission, radical names, Parnelli Jones. That's what made that car so special. Next question. Do you think a modern car with all the electronics will be able to do revive-and drives like we're currently doing with old cars? This is from a guy called Dirty White Boy 40219. I guess we could look up that area code and figure out where that guy lives. I understand the question. There's a lot of technology in new cars, and if you let them sit for 50 years, will they actually run and drive again? I'm hesitant to say hard no because hot rodders overcome. It's what we do, and we figure out how to make it happen. However, I think we also know that there's a lot of cars that are going to go to the junkyard because the touchscreen doesn't work. And how long will the aftermarket support stuff like that? Now, that doesn't really keep the engine from running, and I'm sure people will figure out go-arounds, and there'll be junkyard hot rodders in the future who'll know how to scab this stuff together and make it work. But man, the body modules, the computer modules, I look at how often your iPhone glitches and wonder how that stuff's going to work in 50 years. And while it may, if it's actually damaged and doesn't work, are the sensors and all of those other kind of parts going to be available from the aftermarket in 50 years? I kind of doubt it. And so what I think is going to happen is you're going to see the engines continue to survive because hot rodders will figure out how to run them in standalone applications, the LS, the Coyote, the Hemi being perfect examples of that. But also that points out that the more obscure the car, the less those parts are going to become available. I think it is telling, though, that the barn finds and the hot old rescues of today, which you see everywhere on YouTube at this point, they are almost always carbureted old cars. Fuel injection just becomes an added step of complexity in getting something running after it has been neglected and had bad fuel in it for so long. So I get that question. If you could go back in time and buy a brand new car, what would it be? This is from somebody called Lind STB. Now, obviously, it would be the 55 Mercedes 300 SLR, right? Thing just sold for what, $143 million? So if you could go back and make that investment, I think you would. But for actual personal interest, you know, I would probably go order some weird combination of options on an old Mopar. Probably not even a Hemi car, probably like a 446 pack or something like that. But it's hard to narrow down because I've got so many personal interests in vehicles. I would want, instead of like buying one super expensive cool car, I would want to go pick up a bunch of pickup trucks and Suburbans and mundane stuff and weird option packages. That is something I dig about old 60s cars, is that you could order crazy things that are unexpected. Like, I like it when you can get like a giant luxury Bonneville convertible and it has a 4-speed or a 3 on the tree, or somebody has custom ordered a color from the factory and matched it with some other hideous color. I mean, there's just so many options back then. I think that's what I would investigate. It'd be fun to go back in time. Next, why is the 1968 Dodge Dart the best? This comes from Aggie Fan 45. I've gone on record as to saying the 1968 Dodge Dart is the best Dodge Dart. And I still feel that, but I have to say, as time goes on, you can be less and less choosy about wanting the perfect old muscle car. And so the 67 ends up getting a little bit cooler as time wears on. So does the 69. Now, specifically, I would say the 67 is my least favorite, and it's for a number of reasons. First of all, the grille, all those vertical bars, not a lot of detail in it. I just don't think it's as cool as the 68 with the round turn signals in it and sort of the cross in the middle and a horizontal bar across it. I just think it's a better look. And that theme of the grille ties in sort of with the rest of the car. At least the 67 grille has an impact on the interior of the 1967 Dart. It's got all those very fine, long stripes on the door panels and on the seats that, I don't know, it just doesn't land for me as well as sort of the pleated buckets that you see in a 68. The other thing about the 68 is that it's got that cool under dash pad. It's got 2 dash pads, one on the bottom and one on the top. I think that's pretty neat. The glove box door has a button. And in 67, they just had the top pad and the glove box door just sort of pulled open. I don't know, it's minor things. And of course, the 68 had those radical round side marker lights. The 67 had none. The 69 had rectangular ones. And in the taillights, the 67 looks to me like a 67 Coronet kind of design. They're very much influenced, I think, by the same design ethic within Dodge there. And they don't have much character to them, whereas the 68's got the line across the middle. I just think it's a better detail. And aside from the GT package, the trim, I think, is a little bit better on a 68. And if you're talking about a performance car, I like the 68 hood insert for either the Swinger or... Did they have a Swinger in 68? No, that came in 69, didn't it? I like the 68 GTS ovals on the hood insert. So there's a long and drawn out answer about why the 68 Dart is better than the 67 Dart. Next, would I or have I ever owned a single cab 90s OBS Silverado from Leo 5.7? So that's the GMT 400 body style. And it's interesting, those cars or trucks were commonplace when they were brand new. And I was already working for the magazines by 1991. And so all of the sort of press fleet loaners and all of the trucks that were owned by the magazines that I was working for at the time were all OBS stuff. We had a couple couple Fords, but mostly they were Chevys. And so they were just normal trucks to me. I remember when they changed the dash, that was a better upgrade. And then later on, they just became Gardner trucks and nobody cared about them. And obviously right now they're hot. They're so expensive. And that's because of the whole sport truck fad that was going on when those trucks were brand new. But now people have moved beyond just that nostalgia and they're building the GMT 400s in new and different ways. I have had a handful of them. I had a Tahoe. I had a Crew Cab 3500. I've never had a single cab short bed. Actually, I've never had a extended cab short bed either. I just had that one crew cab. I've been talking forever about wanting to run in land speed racing at the Bonneville Salt Flats or El Mirage Dry Lake again, as I've done with that Hot Rod Magazine special with Keith and Tanya Turk for so many years, but I've wanted to do it with a pickup truck. There's pickup truck classes that I think I can get records in, and so I've looked a lot at those OBS trucks for doing that. I'm not sure if I'm going to follow through at this point because it's just so expensive to build another whole race car from scratch. Although I say that, and right now I just keep buying and flipping cars over and over and over, and if I focused, I could probably do it, but who would I be if I had focus? So yeah, I dig those trucks. If I had one, I'd probably want to make it a race truck instead of a street truck. And of course, there is the problem I always moan about, which is in California, they have to pass smog, unless of course the Jay Leno law passes, in which point they'll start to get more and more feasible for hot rodding. What is the one thing I don't like about car culture today? From the Duke of Cambridge. I had to think for a minute about this when I got this question, and it's going to be this. Everything these days has to be so extreme or it doesn't get noticed. YouTube is kind of responsible for that. Everyone wants the craziest title, the craziest thumbnail, the wildest stunt, the nuttiest car. And while fun and cool, and while I participated in some of that, it's just not practical for the regular guy. And I think it starts to become exclusionary again. You know, when automotive stuff first started coming on YouTube, we were able to show you, like with Roadkill, practical stuff that regular people could do with low buck cars. And I think that's how it got big. And that's how guys like Vice Grip Garage are still enormous, because they're showing you how you can rescue a car for low bucks out of a field somewhere. But then as it starts to get more extreme and everybody has got to have like 3 blowers on 2 LSs in their Mazda Miata and it's 4-wheel drive and they're going to jump it across the Grand Canyon and all this stuff, it's the way to get views. But man, it's more and more and more exclusionary, isn't it? Isn't it? But then there's obviously channels like Whistling Diesel where all they do is take incredibly expensive stuff and destroy it. And people like that, maybe that's not too accessible. I guess it's multiple tiers of different kinds of entertainment. But for me, it's just that drive that everything has to get bigger and bigger and bigger that makes it hard for a guy like me to keep up, because I don't even want to keep up with all of that. Actually, I'll address that question later on in the show about what I would ultimately love to have my channel be all about. And it's not that. I have my Hemi Gremmy. That's pretty absurd. I haven't done anything particularly absurd with it. I have a few other cars that are outrageous, but not like what's really demanded for views these days. And you know what? That's another thing. Having to build your car for views instead of because it's what you want is another problem. And you know what? I am going to be 100% guilty about that one. How often do you buy a whole car or truck just for the drivetrain? From Daddy Mac 166, this was commonplace for me back in the day. I remember once I needed a Buick 455 and a Turbo 400, so I bought, I think, a 72 or 73 Electra 225, and that was a CarCraft magazine, and it was called the Sticker Car, and we covered it in speed stickers, and maybe we cut the top off of it, I don't remember, but we thrashed it around in the dirt and had a lot of fun with it. And then jerked the drivetrain, because that was the thing to do. And later on, I did the same thing. I remember how I had a 73 C20, perfectly good truck, but it was a big block and a Turbo 400. So I jerked the motor and trans out of it. And I saved the grill out of that truck, which is now in my original muscle truck, that 74 C10 that most of you know so well. The grill out of that parts truck is now in the original muscle truck. I always say that buying a whole vehicle is the best way to do an engine swap because you end up getting a battery, all the wiring, maybe you get a fuel pump out of it in the modern times when you want to use an electric fuel pump. And of course, you get the engine and all of the accessory drive and all the injectors because that's the stuff that will nickel and dime you to death doing an engine swap. If you buy an LS out of Marketplace and it's got no accessory drive and you got to put that together, you're buying expensive aftermarket stuff or you're piecing it together from the junkyard. So yeah, I think that is a cool thing to do. As plentiful as they are, why do you think there's low aftermarket support for old Dodge trucks? Dominus D 488. He's absolutely right. You can get anything you want for an old Ford or Chevy truck. The Dodges just don't have that support. It's really only recently that the tin grills started to get more popular, probably because of Steve Dulcich, or probably because the Fords and the Chevys have gotten so expensive that people are seeking other options. It's that thing where as time goes on, vehicles you never would have considered as cool start to get pretty cool. All of a sudden we're seeing four-doors and all sorts of obscure AMCs and stuff that were worthless. People are now hot rodding just because they're neat old cars. So the D100s, and I think both swept line era is cool and also tin grill era is cool. They don't have a lot of aftermarket support. QA1 has started to make some stuff for the suspension on them, and that's neat. Restoration parts, I think, are pretty slim. And the reason is those trucks were not sold in nearly the volume of the first two. And that's why back when they were new, the aftermarket just didn't support them the way they did the Ford and the Chevy. And those parts that were made didn't just sort of continue getting made because as the Dodge was less and less popular as time went on, people just scrapped them. You know, right now you can buy Dodges fairly cheap, even though they're coming up in value. But if you have something specific you want, you can't find it. Try to find a tin grill Dodge Ram Charger these days. If you say, I want myself a 440 Ram Charger, you can't just go get it like you used to. They are drying up. And I think it's just a result of them being less popular when they were new. All right, now we're going to go into the section that is just tech. So these are more technical questions also from fans on Instagram. Which is the best 455, Buick, Olds, or Pontiac? Which one is the easiest to make naturally aspirated power? This is from 19 Mongo 76. Of those three engines, my favorite is the Buick, followed by the Pontiac, followed by the Oldsmobile. Now, I understand that that is not a super technical ranking with solid background reasoning and that it could be argued completely differently. I'm just telling you those are my personal favorites. Why do I like the Buick? Probably sentimentally because the Buick 350 came in Jeeps from the factory, in full-size Jeeps, back in, I think, 68 to 70. I think 71 they switched to AMC. There's probably some leftovers. I actually have a 67 Wagoneer that's not supposed to have a factory Buick 350 in it, but it does. With Jeep, you never know because they trickle model years a little bit based on what parts they have on the shelf. But because they had that Buick 350 in them, which spun off from the earlier Buick V6 that I also liked, I developed an attachment to them, and 455s bolt directly into place where you removed a 350. So they became a cool swap. Also, the Buick is over square. It has a bigger bore and a shorter stroke, which you'll find interesting because people usually say that a longer stroke in an engine means more torque. But the Buick is renowned for having 500 pound-feet and a whole lot of torque, and it's just the opposite. It's a big bore and a short stroke. I like that. I just like the architecture with them. The Pontiac, not quite as much for me. I don't like the open valley on them. I don't like the way the water pump seals to the intake manifold. I don't dislike them. Those are just a couple quirks that they have. And then the Oldsmobile, I think I've been on record as saying that's my least favorite because of the oiling system, honestly. And really, the thing about the aftermarket is, the question is, what's the best one for naturally aspirated horsepower? It's the Pontiac, because the Pontiac has the greatest variety and best aftermarket cylinder heads available. The Buick has stuff that you can get through TA Performance also, but there are a number of places where you can get more Pontiac parts. I think because of the GTO, the Pontiac is the most popular of those three engines for hopping up, and there's the most aftermarket support for them. So there's that answer. What's interesting is to learn more about the NHRA stock eliminator class, as I have in my new job at NHRA, and I looked through it at my first 3 races, and I was like, man, this is all Chevys with a smattering of Fords and Pontiacs, and actually the second most popular make is going to be Mopars. Now the reason is, I believe, that the challenge in that class is to go as fast as you possibly can with stock cylinder head and intake manifold castings, and the cylinder heads are going to be about the most critical thing to performance and airflow on those engines. And most of the Pontiac combinations just can't get there, and they're non-competitive. And you don't see Buicks and Oldsmobiles almost at all. Now, I know a lot of you will scream and tell me how wrong I am, because of course there's going to be divisions with guys running and winning with all of those combinations. But from what I've seen so far, they're dominated by the Chevys and Mopars. I think it's because of cylinder head design. It's also going to be because of the NHRA horsepower ratings, which radically affect the classes that those cars run in. So my answer is not 100% definitive on that part. What do I think of the new Edelbrock copy of the Holley 4150 carburetor? This is from a guy called Lambeth Dave. This is the VRS 4150 from Edelbrock, and yes, it is designed extremely similar to a Holley modular carburetor design. The problem was years ago when Barry Grant knocked off that carburetor design from Holley, Holley sued him and lost, and that opened it up for the aftermarket to make carburetors with that basic classic Holley design, but make some changes to them and call them different things. And then of course Holley bought Barry Grant's Demon Carburetor Company and QFT, which also makes the Brawler. They're all now knocking off their own carburetor design that's been going on since time began. And Edelbrock has just done it. So we're not talking about the Edelbrock carburetors that are basically continuation of Carter AVSs and AFBs. We're talking about the race carburetor that looks kind of like a Holley. The differences about it are that it is taller. It has way more adjustability. It is a 4-circuit carburetor, whereas most of the 4150 Holleys are 2-circuit and 3-circuit. And it has a ton of extra adjustability features. I've never actually run the Edelbrock carburetor, so I'm going to have to lean on the expertise of Steve Brule, who you recall from the Engine Masters TV show, who is the carburetor whisperer, and he told me that those Edelbrock carburetors are really good. You take them out of the box, you put them on the engine. He said you just have to jet them a little bit, but the shape of the fuel curve and everything is really, really ace. Now, features-wise, I like the annular booster in them. I like the 4-circuit adjustability on it, but I really believe that the average guy is going to get lost playing around with that. If you're not a carburetor like fiddler, probably don't use that feature. I'm not saying don't buy the carburetor, but you probably don't need to touch those. However, you probably will use things like the extra idle air bleeds, and that's designed so that you can put the throttle blade position in its optimal place on the transfer slot inside that bore. And then you can adjust your idle speed with secondary or with additional air bleeds so that blade is right in the right place. The other thing is you've got a lot more adjustability on the idle circuit through adjustable idle jets, so you can make it idle nice and lean. There are 2 power valves in those carburetors. So while I haven't touched them, I've heard nothing but good from Brule about them. I like the features that I see, and I would like to mess with one. Ooh, here's a good one. This guy knows me. What's your favorite engine that came factory in a CJ5? This is from PNW Restorations, I assume Pacific Northwest. Here are the engines that you could get in a CJ5. There would have been the F-head, overhead valve, intake, in-block, exhaust, 4-cylinder. There would have been the AMC inline 6, of course, the 232 and 258, the Iron Duke General Motors 4-cylinder, the AMC 304 V8, and in obscure applications, the Perkins diesel. Now, my heart, there's one more, and it's the one that I'm going to pick. I might as well just reveal it. It is the Buick V6 that you could get in the early short fender CJ5s, and that is my favorite one. And I was about to say what you would expect me to like the most is the AMC 304 V8 because V8, and it would be my second choice. But the thing is, it necessarily comes in Jeeps that, in my opinion, are not quite as cool as the earlier one. Because you see, when AMC bought Jeep, they modified the CJ5 to accept their inline six. And that's when the nose of them became longer. The fender is actually about that much longer on the later CJ5s than on the earlier ones that had 4 cylinders and V6s in them. And I don't like them as much, and those are the only ones that came with V8s, and so therefore I like the V6 more. But the V6 has merits on its own. Remember, it is directly from Buick. It is the Buick 198 Fireball V6 that later became the 225. And Buick used them in passenger cars, and when they stopped using them, they sold the tooling to Jeep, and Jeep started making them, or maybe GM was making them for them off the tooling. I probably have that nuance a little bit wrong. And so it's just a Buick, and they had a big, heavy flywheel, and so they would just chug at low speed. They're great crawlers, and they were better than the 4 cylinders for doing sand and stuff like that. So ultimate answer, the Buick V6. Second answer, the AMC V8. Third, the AMC inline 6. Perkins diesel, I don't speak, and the F-head 4-cylinder, I've just never messed with one. I don't dig them. And now, Greg Warnicki asks me, does the size of the harmonic balancer matter? Of course, that's what some people call a vibration dampener. It's a thing that presses onto the front of the crankshaft on your engine. The answer is yes. The other answer is that I have not gone super deep into this, but I will tell you my experience with it. We did a test on the Engine Masters show running a big damper all the way down to nothing but an aluminum hub. And the answer we found was, of course, that the lightest balancer we could put on the thing, the aluminum hub, is the thing that made the most power. Why would that be? Because the engine's not having to accelerate a greater mass. It's the same reason why we'll see more power with a lighter flywheel. It's just a heavier thing that the engine has to accelerate, and that soaks up power that's actually delivered to the rear wheels. Now, other people have done testing that shows with the right damper on it, it eliminates a harmonic that they theorize messes with the valve train, or maybe it's that the crankshaft is twisting more and so the pistons aren't arriving at exactly the right time or giving you the compression ratio that they should have, and that they actually see more power with the right damper on the thing. I haven't seen that. I'm not questioning it because I haven't tested it on enough applications or seen it enough to solidly know, but I can tell you that a lighter one revs quicker and made more power in our test. Now, what it tends to be is that the longer the stroke, the bigger the balancer wants to be. You know what? I really need to get into this with somebody who is a balance expert and balancer tester and learn more about it, because I think I just told you everything that I actually know about it. I do know that a long time ago, legendary Mopar drag racer Dick Landy told me, no balancers with moving parts. I had brought him some trick balancer and he's like, nope, not having it. He's only going to do one that has an elastomer ring on it, which means the rubber ring that is separating the outer shell from the inner shell. The other thing I can tell you is that when I care about an engine, I have almost exclusively used ATI stuff on it and never had a problem that I knew about. But of course, you know, the big thing in engine building is people say, oh, I've done it for 40 years, never had a problem. Well, they don't know that maybe there could be an advantage doing something differently than they're doing, and that could easily apply to me. Oh, here's kind of a cool one. It's a little bit long. Comes from Robert Martin 4660. He says, the big three, the OE Detroit manufacturers, struggled through the 70s to the 90s with CAFE requirements and tighter emission standards. So many things they did were seen as performance killers. With little choice other than finding ways to make things better, they pushed forward. Now we have vehicles with smaller engines making more power naturally aspirated than the muscle car engines did back in the day. Now we see the performance aftermarket offering all sorts of fuel injection, computerized engine controls, and air fuel sensors. Do I think the aftermarket would be offering these things if the OEMs had not suffered through the smog control years? Great question. And the answer is yes, the development from the OEs absolutely allowed the technology trickle down for the aftermarket performance that we see today. It has almost always been that way. It also feeds the other way, where you'll see the OEs noticed hot rodders doing something and then they apply it. So it has always been that relationship of performance increasing first, with hot rodders recognizing that, for example, the Ford flathead V8 was better than the 4-cylinder or the Chevy 4-banger they used to run, and so they swapped that into their cars. And then GM notices that all of the hot rodders have Ford engines in them, and so Zorakis Duntov writes his famous memo and says, we need to get into hot rodding because that's what all the kids are doing. And then that leads to more and more racing development of the small block Chevy, which ends up with GM making more development on the small block Chevy, which probably leads to the LS engines, and it goes on and on and on. But specifically with the technology of fuel injection, all the manufacturing of those sensors and everything likely would not have happened if it had not been for the OE development. And there's some cylinder head flow things that have gone on that definitely came out of the OEs. So I believe the overall answer to that well-written question is yes, we actually needed the smog control era to whip the manufacturers into giving us the performance that we had today. How wild is that? Oh, here's somebody I didn't write who their name was. That's a bummer, so I can't credit you for this. But you asked, what do you look for in old brands of tools? This guy says, I personally like the history behind the defunct tool manufacturers like Plum out of LA. And the old Craftsman tools. You know, I haven't done a lot of research on tool companies and the history of them in particular. I just like the actual tool itself and the story that it tells and the way that it was made, that we don't do things today. Just a couple of examples. I've shown you in my Roadrunner video the ratchet I have that has the pawl that you just click back and forth with your thumb. To me, that's a neat old design. Now, if you get mud in it, it's going to be a downer. But other than that, it's pretty foolproof. I really like it. I have a number stamp where you rotate a wheel on the end of it to the number that you want and you smack it, and that's all old and burnished. It has like a great look to it. So it's actually the functionality of those old tools and the wondering of where has it been and what has it done that makes me love them. And I do buy them at swap meets and stuff. Although I will tell you, just as an aside here, that when the Motor Trend shows all shut down, you know that we had that big old hankin' shop that we worked on. You mostly saw it in Hot Rod Garage, but it was also seen on Roadkill sometimes, and of course at Hot Rod Magazine. And when they shut down, I ended up buying all of the Snap-on hand tools from them. I got them in bins over there. And so that was a cool score for me because I have never been able to be a Snap-on guy. Now I've got that stuff, but I will still seek the old greatness from Russ the Tool Guy at the Long Beach Swap Meet. That's where I get a lot of the stuff. Russ Pearson. You seem genuinely surprised by some of the things you did on Engine Masters. What's the oddest thing that you ever did to a car that never should have actually worked, but actually worked good? I will tell you. I grew up reading magazines and seeing stuff sticking out of the hood on street machines and thinking it was the coolest thing ever. Sometimes it was a blower, sometimes it was a tunnel ram. But then I went through the 80s and even the 90s when I was working there, and I read all of the sort of hand-wringing stories about you can't drive a tunnel ram on the street, and a supercharger, you know, a blower sticking through the hood is just junk for a street machine. You can't drive the thing. But then what I discovered is that tunnel rams and blowers are great, especially on the street. Let's address tunnel rams first. The common belief is, oh, you can't have that thing. It doesn't make power until you hit 7,000 RPM. It's only for high RPM. Now that can be true. This tunnel ram right behind me here is a Holley Pro Dominator, and it has pretty short intake runners. However, you look at something like the Edelbrock street tunnel rams, not the low cross ram ones, but like the, what would it be, like a SY1, I believe? No, that's a Smoky ram. The street tunnel ram I'm forgetting the name. You look at the street tunnel ram style with the longer runners, and those things make great torque. The longer the intake runner, the more it tends to favor low and mid-range power. The shorter the intake runner, the more it tends to favor high RPM power. So yes, a short runner tunnel ram can tend to be just for high RPM, but the long ones, they work great on the street. And the people saying you can't put two carburetors on it, why would you put two 750s on a small block Chevy that only needs one 750? You know what? It works. It's fine. You can tune it to be great. And if you fear it, you can get some of the modern dual quad throttle body injection deals, and they work pretty good too, but nowhere near as well as they work on top of a Roots supercharger. Turns out these things are actually great for the street. You put them on an engine, even with a small camshaft in it, you have more low-end torque than you know what to deal with. You have killer throttle response. The thing fires up immediately. Give it a couple shots of gas and vroom, it comes right to life. Now, the problem with the Roots supercharger is that they do get terrible gas mileage because they have a big draw on the engine, you know, just spinning the thing. And they do tend to heat the air and have some overheating problems. But just for the drivability of the supercharger and the blowers themselves, it almost improves stuff. You buy these Holley supercharger carburetors, slap them on top of a 671 or an 871, they usually work pretty well, and you'll find your car is completely drivable. Now, the big problem with both of them is cold startup. If you've got a tunnel ram and you're in really cold weather, it can take pumping a lot of fuel in it to get the thing going. They are better in the Southwest. They are better in the summer. But I would say those are the things that surprised me as a kid who grew up with them and then were told to believe that they were lousy and then have actually tuned and driven a lot of them myself. Tunnel rams and blowers are in fact great. And that's the end of that paper. We move on. Another one who I didn't write down their name. Bummer. What do you think of a 4.3 Vortec engine for a project car? Oh, I do have the name. It is Tracy Mott 39. So the 4.3 Vortec engine is a 90-degree V6 that is just like a small block Chevy, missing two middle cylinders. That's how they made the thing. And because of that, I think they're great. They use a lot of small block Chevy parts. You can use the pistons from them and the fuel pumps, and that might be it, because obviously the gaskets are different, the heads are different. And the crankshaft's actually different because it is an even fire V6, and with a 90-degree bank angle, that means it has to have a split crank pin. And I think that means they have, do they have a 200 rod pin? Maybe they do. They have a larger rod pin than a regular small block Chevy, so the rods don't cross over either. But they're just familiar architecture. You can use the same rocker arms and lifters and push rods in them. You do need to look out. In '92, they started making them with balance shafts. There's a shaft running right over the lifter valley that helps smooth the thing out, which can be good, but for hot rodding, I don't prefer it quite as much. There aren't enough intake manifolds available for them, which is kind of a downer. You can get a Holley Performer. If you're lucky, you can go find one of the 23-degree NASCAR, like Bush era intake manifolds that they used on those things, although those need a little bit of modification for distribution in order to run really well. I built one once that had 300 horsepower, and we put a Vortec supercharger on it, made 500 horsepower, till it split the cylinder wall. And of course, you saw me and Finnegan ruin the 4.3 Chevy V6 that was in our Rotson project car as well. And we had that great clip of us doing the Office Space scene, destroying that poor little V6. But yes, I like them. They're actually great for small street rods and for Jeeps and stuff like that. I think you can still get Brodix cylinder heads for them. They may have discontinued that, but they used to make maybe a 195 and a 210 intake runner cylinder head for those. A guy named Fox Can Fix It asks me, what do you look for in a project vehicle? What are some of your no-goes when looking at one? And what he means, of course, is looking at one to buy as a project. For me, I am just completely overdoing anything other than mechanical stuff. I don't want to paint a car. I don't want to do an interior one. I don't want to fiddle around with trying to make window regulators work. I know there's fiddly guys who can do all this stuff, and I envy you. My life does not afford the time for it. My patience does not last through it. I want to fiddle with suspension and build engines. That's kind of my thing. And so when I look at a project, I decide to myself, does it have paint I can live with? because the likelihood of me painting another car is extremely low. Does it have a cool enough look the way it is? And am I going to have to fiddle with window regulators? That's like my Achilles heel. I hate it when you get some car where the window falls down or is all crooked. And so that's really what I look for is well, you know what? Here's another thing about it. I've often said that I can look in a car and know if it's mine or not. And for example, let's say I don't love every 62 Chevy Biscayne out there, but I can look at one and go, that's my 62 Chevy Biscayne. Somehow it just lands with the right look and the right stance and the right wear. And there's maybe one parked right next to it that I don't dig at all because it's a different color and it's too high and the interior is too tweed or something. So I definitely just have this eye and this sense of, yeah, that one fits me and that one doesn't. So that's another huge part of project car buying for me. What is your opinion on the most reliable O2 sensor and gauge for the money? TD Jones. TD Jones, 1911 USMC. I guess he likes that 1911. What was this question again? Oh, O2 sensors. This is another interesting thing that we did on the Engine Masters show. We did a comparison of a whole bunch of different oxygen sensors and air-fuel ratio readouts. I expected them all to deliver wildly different numbers. We put all of the sensors in the same place in the collector and ran them all at the exact same time and data logged what every single one of them reported. And whether it was a cheap gauge or a high dollar one, they all reported the same numbers. As far as reliability, I will say that personally, I have had difficulty with the Innovate ones. I've crashed 3 of them in the past 5 years. Could be an installation problem. But what I'm using now is just the simple Autometer ones, and they work. As far as the reliability, I think it really comes down to they're all using the same actual sensor. The reliability is probably in the gauge itself or in the processing itself. So there's that. Another one that comes out of the old Engine Masters TV show. When you guys were doing Engine Masters, you made cylinder head changes all the time, but never talked about the head studs. He says, I always replace them with new ones every time. Did you guys just reuse them because it was only a few pulls, or did you replace them every time? No. It has never crossed my mind to replace head studs unless there was an actual problem with them. We would reuse them over and over and over, and it was pretty much okay. That might not be the right technical answer. ARP might tell you there's a fatigue cycle on them, but I haven't run into it. You may be thinking of modern engines that have torque to yield fasteners, and those aren't studs, they would be bolts. And obviously those are the ones where you torque them to spec and then give them another 90 degrees, and they're designed to stretch a lot. And once they've stretched, you're not supposed to reuse them, although we have. But as far as getting an ARP head stud, we would reuse them over and over. The guys use them on race cars and service cylinder heads all the time. It's not just a regular wear item until it ends up having an actual issue. And that's it for the technical questions. Now I'm going to answer some stuff that is general and non-automotive, and there's very few of these, so let's see. What sparked my interest in old signage? Guy says, I think it's rubbing off on me now. Stowe77. What he's referring to is that here on YouTube, I do a lot of road trips. And a key part of my road trip life is finding neat old signs, hand-painted stuff on the sides of buildings, old neon, just the plastic 1970s bar beer signs, anything like that, I'm fascinated with. And he asks, what sparked my interest in them? I think it's my love of nostalgia and history and of old America. And I see them and I always think, man, that has got more art to it than it ever had. Or maybe it flashes me back to a time that I personally remember when that's how the whole world looked. And also, I think of the stuff that's way beyond my life, how much older it is. And it's like, wow, that sign has been there for so long. And how many people did it attract to this motel? Or how did they come with that idea? And so many of them are so creative and they weren't all the same. There was no chains. And so hotels had different signs. I love the old stuff. I love the skill of the hand sign painting. And I like looking at the genuine old stuff because there's something about them that guys just often don't get just right. And so I like looking at the genuine old stuff. How did my fascination with the desert start? That's another thing. I love desert road trips. I think it's because I grew up in Southern California and I got hooked on four-wheeling from some guys that I knew just post high school. And I spent a ton of time just exploring out there in the desert because it was so open and free. You could go anywhere you wanted. Nobody messed with you. And you would be careful not to kill desert tortoises, even though that was a big problem back in the day that people thought we should shut down the desert because four-wheelers were killing the tortoises, and they probably were, but I never did. And I just love the fact that there is life like that out in the desert that you never really hear about, and the cactus and the terrain. And I prefer heat to cold, and I just love the desert evenings when the sun is down, you're not getting blasted, it's still 70 degrees. It's just perfect for sitting around and having a beer. When it's a little cool outside, it's perfect for a campfire. When you're in Arizona and it's an overcast, really cloudy, dark cloud day, and the sun comes underneath those clouds and lights up the terrain, to me, like, that's just the best thing ever. The other thing about desert people is that they just create an ethic of making it happen with whatever you have and living on a shoestring that I think is really cool. I like the stories about guys like Burrow Schmidt, who was out there just digging a tunnel through a mountain for most of his life just because he had to get to the other end, and he built a cool little cabin and lived out there for so long. Just lots of those stories and lots of being there. There's a bunch of reasons I love the desert. Here's another one that's about my road trips. I didn't write down the person's name. How do I do my research on locations that I visit? And do I have background or do I research it as I find it? This is a thing a lot of people have asked. That might be why I didn't write down somebody's name, because it's just very, very common. People ask me all the time about, can you send me a route map for your latest road trip? Or can you plan a road trip for me with, you know, all these different places that you go? Here's the secret. I don't plan anything. Get in the car, decide what region that you want to go to, and go. And just find the stuff. Come to a T and take it. Come to a Y and take it, I think is what Yogi Berra said, right? Just let the road find you. The way that I find neat old towns is often you can see them on satellite view, and you can see if there's buildings there that are potentially cool or not. So maybe that'll help me point in a direction. I use an app called Roadside America, which is all about finding quirky roadside attractions. And that can help force you to drive into places and neighborhoods to see things which might not be that great, but on the way, you find that awesome old gas station or that cool barn find or the neat old signs. And so you just, I have a new thing. My new catchphrase is, you don't know unless you go. So just go. That's how you find the cool stuff. All right, now there's a whole bunch of questions that people have asked that are kind of just about me, and some of them are more automotive, so I'm going to go through them. I'll probably go through these quicker is what I'll do. DD Cook 07 says, are you friends with Mike Wolf? Obviously the guy from American Pickers. No, I've never met the guy. I've communicated with him just the tiniest bit in DMs on Instagram. I would love to hang out with the guy. He's awesome. What was your first concert and best concert? My first one was Quiet Riot at the Forum for the Condition Critical Tour. So what would that be, like 1983 or 4, something like that? The best one, I had to think through this because I've seen a lot. I've seen Motley Crue a bunch of times. I saw the Kiss reunion tour. I saw the Eagles reunion tour, even though I can't stand the Eagles. I saw Deep Purple because you kind of have to. But I think the best one that I ever saw was when Aerosmith reformed for the Permanent Vacation tour, and Dokken was opening for them, and my friends and I went down there, and we were sitting near the front, and there was all sorts of other rock stars sitting all around us because Aerosmith coming back was a big deal, and man, did they put on a show. I'm not much of an Aerosmith on the radio guy, but in concert, really good. What's my favorite Sunset Strip band? I think people know that I'm into the whole hair metal thing because I grew up in Hollywood in the Sunset Strip era. And technically a Sunset Strip band would be Van Halen, but they were before my time. I never actually saw them. I never saw Motley Crue on the Strip either. I think I might have seen like Nikki Sixx playing with some other people or something like that, but I never saw them. I was hard into Rat back in the day. Never saw them on the Strip either. But you know who I did see? Who I actually think's a good band, even though it's embarrassing to say so and people want to shut them down, is Warrant. Warrant actually is a good live show. You know what? I had a ton of questions about my family. And the thing is, I've just always made a habit of keeping my family off the internet. This is work for me. I don't want them to become public figures. And so that's that. It will continue to be that way. Would you be into an Italian sports car if given the chance? No. I don't care about supercars at all. Here's the thing I've often said about people is that car guys don't just want to go fast. They want to go fast in the car that they like. Clearly, modern supercars are way faster than most of the stuff I drive every day. I don't care. They could be more comfortable. They could be more awesome. They could be worth more. They could attract more attention. I don't care. I don't like them. And so, no, that is not me. It's kind of the same answer when people ask me about EVs. Obviously, I do the whole gasoline forever thing, which has been great. I don't mind if somebody else buys an EV. I just don't like it or care about it myself. I can't develop a bond with it. Have you ever considered owning a Studebaker? From Automotive Culture Scene. Yes, as a matter of fact, I just sold the 47 Studebaker that was on the Roadworthy Rescue Show that I bought from Motor Trend when they folded up. And I flipped that thing, I think, at a pretty fair price to somebody. I also had two 53s at one time that I was considering building into Bonneville cars, because the 53 is that really aerodynamic, what they call Raymond Loewy coupe, because his design firm was involved in designing it. And that is the really, really cool one. And I would definitely have another one. Do I have any guilty pleasure cars from J. Morris 440? You know, I would take any one of a number of little Japanese sports cars that are rear wheel drive. The Miata, I'd actually do that. First Gen RX-7, I love. I would have a new GR86. There's something about the whole, I'd rather drive a slow car fast than a fast car slow. All of those cars are not that fast, and they're a riot to throw around. And so while I would look goofy in any of them, I would also have one. Are lifted vans cool? Wow, really, Paul? Yeah, I like a good 4x4 van. The older, the better. As someone who's always been in the part supply side of the business most of my working life, I've been interested in your time at the dealership and would like to know more about it. From Escape Reality 949. I worked at the Dodge dealership behind the parts counter right after I left high school, and this was 1984 or 5, I can't remember. And I really loved it because it was still old school automotive. There was still that distribution network. There was still the dealer feeding all the local parts stores. There were way more parts stores then than there are now, independent ones. There was way more places, like I remember Valley Friction was a company that would rebond your brake pads. They would redo a clutch disc for you. Anything that involved nasty, cancer-causing asbestos bonded to metal, they would do. And you'd go in there and there'd just be guys covered in dust, pounding out all this stuff. I remember the old school machine shops that I would go to back then. And of course, then there was the big distribution part of it. Sometimes I would get to go to the Chrysler main distribution warehouse in Ontario, and most of the stuff was still done on paper. There was computers in use then, but they would do that thing with, you know, those green and white lined papers that would come in a stack, and it would have the perforated holes on the side, and they would just print out these order numbers, and I would get them, and I would pick them out of the blue boxes that would come from the Chrysler warehouse, and I would shelve them. And I learned a lot about the way things worked, and I felt that I came in right at the tail of that old school distribution model and old school guys. The person I worked for at the Dodge dealership was Mr. Casey. He was a World War II vet. He loved his motorhome, and that era is just kind of going away. When they were new, did you care about cars like your Suburban? I have a 1990 V1500. Or did that grow with age? Definitely grows with age. I think this is a predictable path that car guys take, which is the cars they remember from their youth that were maybe just family cars or whatever, all of a sudden become interesting because of nostalgia later in life. And I love my 90 Suburban, even though I don't love 90 Suburbans. I don't even love the paint color on mine or the peeling clear coat or anything like that, but it is just so cush to drive around. It is just great, and it doesn't have a bunch of modern gewgaws that bother me, and it's super comfortable, and so it's like a perfect thing for me. Are you putting the original burnt orange interior back in your Super Bee at any time? Yeah, my Super Bee that I bought when I was 15 years old is a factory Go Mango car, and it had a burnt orange interior, which was a fairly common thing, that color combo back in the day. When I got it, it had already been spray vinyl dyed in black. And as I progressed with it over the years, I ended up putting an interior out of a different Super Bee into it that was legitimately black, but the headliner was still orange and painted. And then I put a headliner in it, and then I reupholstered everything, and now all of the burnt orange is gone. And I think that would actually be a cool thing to do, is to put it back to burnt orange, even though I've never had it that way, but it might spark sort of a little bit more intrigue for me in that car. How's the transition from TV stuff to what you have going on now been positive for the work-life balance, or are you working a similar amount? Dirigi14. You know what? I didn't realize how good I had it doing the TV shows. I was out of town all the time, and now I'm home more, which is a fantastic step. But trying to feed the YouTube channel and do my event and sell t-shirts and work out sweepstakes and do my NHRA deal and do some announcing on the side ends up being way more chaotic and busy than it was when I was just doing the TV shows and kind of had to plan some things, order some parts, and show up on set. But the big deal is that I was gone way more than I was home. And now that's the other way around. So that's good. Have I ever owned a Land Cruiser? Yes, I had a 78 FJ40 as my first 4x4 and the only Japanese car I've ever owned. What's your oddest encounter at a junkyard? People or cars? From a guy called The Last American Hero 71. Oh, the Land Cruiser question was some guy called Thomas Moore 66. What's your oddest encounter at a junkyard? I think you saw it in Roadkill. Finnegan and I went somewhere and an old man hated us and came after us with a lead pipe. It's about all the details I remember about that, but we got out of there. Let's see. How about some CHiPS episodes? You must have some stories on film locations. CHiPS was shot all around everywhere where I grew up. Specifically in my neighborhood, I remember that they shot the episode where the kids were racing around in go-karts. I don't remember if the kids were just racing or if they were in a crime ring or what the story was, but I remember because I lived in a windy area that they shot that near me, and I remember riding my bike over there and watching them shoot it and thinking it was really cool. And that's probably my closest CHiPS story. And that's it for now. Thanks to everybody who made it this far. And now I gotta run and jump on an airplane because I am going to Alabama, where Keith Turk and I are gonna get in a clapped out old van and try and make it all the way here to LA for an upcoming video on the channel. Don't forget, I'm here every Thursday at 3 p.m. Pacific time. Just remember, Thursday is Friday. Do me a favor and share the channel. And of course, you can go to shop.davidfreiburger.com at any time in the week and any time of the day and pick up any of my merch. I do have firing order shirts now in a variety of different colors. All right, I'm headed out to go have some fun. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you next time on the David Freiburger channel.